Hello, Gene Schwimmer here. Welcome to today's vlog. Before I get into today's subject, just a little bit of housekeeping, actually a small milestone for me. And when I say small, I mean very small in the enormity of the YouTube universe. But for me, well, as I said, it's a small milestone. But today I saw that I got a couple of comments, and this is actually the first time, unless I'm forgetting something, that I've been able to say comments plural. I've always, as far as I can remember, gotten maybe one comment and usually no comments, but this time I got two. So I'm really happy to say thank you to commenters. I appreciate it. I hope you'll be joined by more commenters in the future, but I appreciate it. I appreciate that you took the time. And for me, well, what can I say? Onward and upward. I hope I get more subscribers too. I really enjoy doing this. I just like visiting with all of you folks. Now, today's subject, I wanted to talk about Iran and the attack on the Saudi oil field, but the situation is still in flux. I wanted to, well, I guess play a little bit of armchair general, state my opinion of what I think the administration, what Donald Trump should do. I want to see what they're going to do, what they have to say before I really give any comment. It's, as I said, still in flux. As I'm recording this, it's maybe a few hours after Pompeo, Secretary of State Pompeo, arrived in Saudi Arabia. All I've heard so far from him or from the visit is that he said that what the Iranians did was an act of war. There's a classic response, of course, to an act of war. I don't want to say anything till I hear and see from the administration what they intend to do. So instead, I'm going to talk about the Israeli elections that just occurred. The election was yesterday. The results actually are still coming in as well. They're counting because the election was very close. But I do want to talk about it because there's a wider point that this particular election raises. But before I get into the particulars of the election, I just want to say to all of my fellow Americans, just be happy that as messed up as our political system seems to be, it is so much better than other countries' systems. And I mean other democratic countries' systems, and I mean specifically parliamentary systems, which is what you have in Israel, but also in England. So we've got all this mess with Brexit. Well, that will be a future video. I don't want to talk about Britain right now, except that they're talking about a constitutional crisis, which in their situation is especially problematic because England, unlike we Americans, England does not have a written constitution. So, for example, there is a case about Brexit. Well, as you probably know, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, prorogued, that's what they call it, proroged Parliament, which means really shutting down Parliament for, or suspending Parliament for a certain amount of time in order for a newly elected Prime Minister, or in case of Boris Johnson, I guess you would say almost appointed, because he was elected by the Parliament. They did not have a general election. That's a whole other ball of wax or can of worms, I guess, depending on your point of view. But on this issue of prorogation, there's a tradition in England under their system that when you have a new prime minister taking office, that the prime minister gives something called a Queen's Speech, in which it's kind of like our State of the Union, not a State of the Union in the sense of where the president talks about the State of the Union, of what shape the country is in, but when as has become a tradition, the president uses the State of the Union to talk about the future, to talk about his plans going forward. So that's what the Queen's speech is, and it's traditional to suspend Parliament while the Prime Minister prepares the speech, his agenda. But there is a counter argument that Boris Johnson is really doing this to keep Parliament out of session as they move closer to the October 31st Brexit date, to prevent any more, well, I would call it mischief by the Parliament by having it not even sitting. So the Parliament is challenging what Boris Johnson did in their Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court is hearing these arguments, but the Supreme Court does not have a written constitution as we do against which to measure the merits of the two arguments, arguments on either side. So that creates a real mess. And then in Israel, because we're going to be talking about Israel, they have something called, they don't have a constitution at all. They have something called the Basic Law. And they have the same kind of problem. But the main problem that Israel has is that, well, it's a problem or a potential problem of all parliamentary systems, is which you don't have the kind of strong executive, a president like we have, and you don't have these checks and balances. Really, whatever the Parliament wants to do, the Parliament can do. But you also have, unlike our system, which was designed actually not to have political parties at all, that was the idea, but we luckily, if we're going to have parties, we broke down into basically two parties. So it started out with the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and today it's the Republicans and the Democrats. It just turned out that way. So we don't have the same kind of problem. And then even if you, well, whether you have parties or not, however many parties you have, you still have Congress voting on legislation, and then you have a president who is separate from the Congress, who can veto and must sign bills. They don't have that in a parliamentary system. So the problem that you have in Israel, now that we're finally, as usual, I like to digress, I hope it's interesting, but in Israel you have many parties, you have several parties, and the problem with parliamentary systems is because you don't have a strong and separate executive, you need a majority in Parliament to get anything done. And that's the problem that Israel has, especially because they have all these little tiny dinky parties of 2 seats or 3 seats. There are 120 seats in the parliament, the Knesset, they call it the Knesset, that's the Israeli parliament. And you need 61 members all rowing in the same direction in order to govern. So what happens is that if a party does not manage to reach that 61 vote threshold, then that party must form a coalition, make arrangements with as many other parties as necessary to form a governing coalition. So then you have all this horse trading that we don't have in our system, thank God, where they'll say, oh, okay, well, this party, I'll join the coalition, but you have to make me defense minister. And then you have another party saying, well, I'll join, but you have to make me the defense minister, or I want to be even the prime minister. So it's very difficult sometimes for Israel especially to form a government. Now you also have a problem that there are certain parties, well, it's in the English system too, that you have to reach a certain percentage. You need a certain percentage of the votes when you have the election in order to get any seats at all. I think it's about 14% in England that if a party doesn't get at least 14% of the votes, then they don't get any seats in Parliament. In Israel, I think it's 2 or 3%. So this leads to what I'm going to talk about right now, because in this election you had the results are still being counted, but there's over 90%, something like 95% of the vote in, and it looks like the Likud party, which is Benjamin Netanyahu's party, they're going to get 32 seats. Then the next party, well, it's not the next party, they actually are the party that is ahead, the blue and white party, which I assume blue and white is because of the colors of the Israeli flag, which is blue and white. They got 33 seats, it looks like, so that's one more seat than Likud got. So the president picks a party. The president of Israel is really, just like in other parliamentary systems, it's technically the head of the state, but it's a ceremonial position mainly. The president has no power. The prime minister has the power. But the prime minister goes to the president in Israel the same way that the prime minister in England goes to the Queen to charge one of the parties with having the first try to form a government, to make a coalition with all these parties. So it should be the blue and white party. They got one more seat, they have the most seats. Blue and white might sit it out and let Benjamin Netanyahu try to form a coalition, and then if he fails, which is what the blue and white expects, then blue and white would be in a stronger position. That's where they are right now, and you have, well, I might as well, since we're talking about Israeli politics, I might as well throw this in too if you're interested. There's a party called Yisrael Beitenu, which means Israel our home. That's basically what it means in English. And it's headed by Avigdor Lieberman is his name. And he's getting, it looks like he's going to get about 8 or 9 seats. The point is you have these little parties that there aren't enough to give either this blue and white or the Likud party sufficient votes to, or sufficient seats to make a majority. So the problem they're running into is this Avigdor Lieberman, because he has 9 seats. He has enough. He's basically a kingmaker. He can decide which of those 2 parties that got the most seats can form a government because he has enough seats to put either one over the top. Now the problem is that Israel, it's supposed to be well, it is, it's a modern democracy, but you have these religious parties that have, because you need so many parties to form a coalition, you have a party called Shas, and you have another one, United Torah Judaism. There are 2 or 3 smaller parties that Benjamin Netanyahu, that the right needs to form a government, and then they just barely have a governing majority. That's what they had. In fact, the whole reason they had this election was because Avigdor Lieberman, he was in the coalition with Likud, and then he left. And when he left, then the government collapsed because they no longer had the majority of seats. He is insisting that he will not join a coalition with the religious parties because he wants Israel to be a more secular state. Because even though Israel is a democracy, there is no civil marriage, for instance, in Israel. You cannot say if a Jew and a Christian want to get married, they can't go to City Hall and get married because there is no such marriage. So Lieberman won't sit with them. And then you have the blue and white party. What Avigdor Lieberman wants is he wants a unity government, which would be the blue and white and Likud governing together. Then you would have a very solid majority. You would have 65 seats right there, plus Avigdor Lieberman's 9 seats. That gives you a very strong majority. But the problem is that the other 2 parties are resisting that, and you have, even if there's, well, now it's being reported that Netanyahu is considering agreeing to a unity government with blue and white, which there would be a rotating premiership where Netanyahu would be the prime minister for a while and a certain amount of time, and then it would switch over to Benny Gantz. He's the head of the blue and white party, and then he would be prime minister for a while, and it would switch back and forth. The problem is that Benny Gantz is saying that he will not be in a coalition that has Netanyahu. So you can see it's a big mess over there, but this brings me to the point, which is why I had to give you all this background. Otherwise, unless you're a big follower of Israeli politics, it's not going to make a whole lot of sense to you. But there is a party called the Joint List, and these are Arabs, Arab Israelis, and what the Joint List is, as I said, you need a certain amount of votes in order to get even a single seat in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. Now, there are Arab parties that meet that threshold or that have met that threshold, but they get only a small number of seats. So what has happened is that this has been going on for a while. The smaller Arab parties, all these small Arab parties, they got together and they formed a combined party called the Joint List, which puts them all together, and then they can add all their votes of each of their parties together, and then they easily meet the threshold, and then they can have more seats in Parliament. Now, the reason I'm bringing this all up is, well, I'm going to put up a couple of headlines for you. Israel's Arabs poised to gain new voice after tight election. Joint Arab List leader, we just became the third largest faction. And this is what's really important. They've got, I think last time I checked, they look like they're going to have 12 seats, which does not seem a lot, but remember that the Likud has 32 and Benny Gantz has 33, so 12 is a big deal. They are an important part of a coalition too. Now, if they were to sit with Netanyahu's Likud party, then there would be no need for Lieberman, and it would be very simple for Netanyahu to form a governing majority without the religious party. So he would not need them either. The problem is that the Arabs and this Arab party, they can't stand Netanyahu, so there's no chance that they will be in a coalition with the Likud and Netanyahu. Then you have blue and white, so they are going to ally with blue and white, and that gets blue and white almost to a governing majority, but it's still not enough. So there's all this horse trading going on. But the reason this really matters is because, well, number one, I have a couple of main points, but this is the first point, and probably the biggest one, is that you hear all the time from these Israel haters, including our resident anti-Semite in the House of Representatives, Ilhan Omar, accusations of Israel being a quote-unquote apartheid state. So my questions are, how come we have Arabs in the Knesset and forming a sizable, influential bloc in the Knesset such that the Jewish members need them in order to form a government? I mean, I can't imagine anything, I don't remember anything like that in South Africa, the home of apartheid. So if Israel is an apartheid state, then how are these Arab representatives, these members of the Knesset, how are they even there? But they are. And another question is, how can there be an Arab judge on Israel's Supreme Court? I mean, how is that possible if Israel is an apartheid state? And then there's the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, the Israeli military. How can there be Arabs, and there are Arabs in the Israeli army? I mean, why would, and you have to remember this, that in Israel, Jews are subject to the draft. Almost all of them have to serve. Arabs do not have to serve. They are not subject to the draft. The logic behind it is because Israel does not want to force Arabs to kill other Arabs, which is all of Israel's enemies. It's Arabs. So they don't want to force Israeli Arabs to have to kill other Arabs. So those Arabs that are in the Israeli army, they are in there voluntarily, and they are not just enlisted men and women. They are officers too. So that is my first main point that nobody seems to mention, nobody talks about. Israel is not an apartheid state. It's crazy. It's just an absurd accusation, and there is the proof, which brings me now to my second and final point, which is that this joint Arab list that I mentioned, this was kind of a first for them, because they just refused to recognize Israel, to give Israel any legitimacy, so they would run for office and they would be in the Knesset, but they would not join any coalition. They would not even try to exert any influence. They just would not participate. But you can see how much power they had when this time they decided that they would participate, and not just in being willing to join a coalition, but in the election itself. They went out, they canvassed, they actively canvassed in the Arab areas of Israel, and they urged the Arabs to get out and vote. That is what is important. And then, besides the whole country, you have an interesting special case, which is Jerusalem. Jerusalem is kind of unofficially divided between a western half that is mostly Jewish, and then you have a mostly Arab eastern half. Now, the eastern half, there is a very great disparity in the infrastructure and the public services and the housing. It's not as good, the roads, the sewers, whatever you want to name, in the Arab section as it is in the Jewish section. Now, one reason for this is that the international community, or a lot of it, refuses to recognize Jerusalem as a united city under Israel. So that the Israelis, because people keep talking about dividing Jerusalem, there is a disincentive for Israel to improve any part of East Jerusalem, because Israel's critics will complain that, well, they're trying to make the unification of Jerusalem permanent, which, as a practical matter, let's be honest, that's what it is. There are no circumstances under which Israel is going to divide Jerusalem again, and then, for one thing, be denied access to their religious sites as they were when the city was divided. Case in point being the Western Wall, which they weren't allowed to visit. But it's also a matter of the refusal of the Arabs in East Jerusalem to participate in the municipal elections. Now, one reason that Arabs have talked about running for the municipal council of Jerusalem but haven't done it is quite simply because when an Arab talks about doing that, that Arab gets death threats from other Arabs. So obviously they're in physical danger if they decide to do that. But it hurts the Arabs for the same reason that I told you that it hurts the Arabs in Israel as a whole. Because if you don't have representation on the Jerusalem Municipal Council, then you don't have power. You can't vote on anything. You can't propose legislation and policies and zoning ordinances. You cannot demand reallocation of resources to help the eastern part because you're not on the municipal council, you're not participating, and so you have no voice. You have no way to make yourself heard, and you have no way to make yourself accommodated. So my final point, putting these first 2 points together, is that it hurts Arabs in Israel not to recognize Israel, the legitimacy of the state. They should, I urge them to, they should recognize the legitimacy of Israel, and they should run for office, and they should attain power, and they should give themselves a means to influence what happens in Israel, because they live there too. That's it. That's my vlog for today. So again, thanks for stopping by. Thumbs up if you liked the video. Share the video with anybody that you think would benefit from it. Oh, and let me thank you for sticking around. I think this video is going to be a little bit longer than they usually are. So if you're still with me, I really do appreciate that. And I would appreciate, as I've said in the past, any comments you want to put in the comments section. You can also subscribe. And finally, come back and see me again. I look forward to seeing all of you, whether you agree or disagree. And until I do see you all again, bye.